Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 14th of March, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. We start today's report off with a brief admin note. Your area study is the foundation of emergency preparedness and community security. My question to you is, during an emergency in the future, do you have all the local information that you need in order to make solid, time-sensitive decisions? If not, then you should register for this year's Area Study Challenge that's coming up next week, starting on Tuesday, runs 18 to 20 March. It is free intelligence training over the course of 3 evenings. I will take you through my process step by step so you can get a basic area study done. Head over to areaintelligence.com, maybe www.areaintelligence.com. Sign up. There's 3 free days of training. There's also an optional training day coming up on Saturday. We're going to talk about 3 scenarios that you should be planning for in emergency preparedness. Again, areaintelligence.com. All right, let's move on. We'll go ahead and jump inside the Beltway. There's a lot going on, Robert. Today's a massive day in DC. Let's just start with this Trump administration plan to invoke the Enemy Aliens Act. I guess that's designed to accelerate arrests and deportations of illegals.
Exactly. And this is from a U.S. official who was speaking on background saying that Trump could invoke the Enemy Aliens Act as soon as today. And the idea is that this is going to unlock some broad powers to arrest and deport illegal immigrants and bypass these immigration courts that are run through the Department of Justice.
Mm-hmm.
And then
realistically, Robert, Tom Homan said 3-ish weeks ago that by now we should have seen the aperture open. And I know Trump was very unhappy with the relatively low number of illegals being arrested. Do you know how this Enemy Aliens Act is going to facilitate what is, solid effort, A for effort so far, but it's kind of been a trickle compared to what we were promised?
I think what it does is just allow the administration to, like they said, they hope to bypass these immigration courts. And I think the concern here is that if they did this without invoking the Enemy Aliens Act, they would just see even probably another 100 lawsuits against these removals. And of course, if they go through with it by the time that the lawsuits actually get to the courts, it's difficult for the these nonprofits, these pro-immigration groups to reverse that. But I think they're so far. I did see, I think a couple weeks ago, that they were starting to do this with certain types of illegal immigrants. I think specifically ones that were convicted of other crimes. They would go to these state prisons and state jails and pick them up when they were released on bond or whatever, and then deport them. But I think in this case, they're talking about expanding this to all illegal immigrants, regardless of if they've been convicted of a violent crime or not.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this was one of our triggers. We're going to talk much more about this, not only on the show, but coming up on the roundtable, coming up at 10 a.m. Central Time. We're going to talk a lot more about what this means for left-wing movements if or when the administration does just go after all illegals, not just criminals. Let's move on here to FEMA. What's the latest going on there?
So FEMA said it's investigating organizations that received grants through what's called the Shelter and Services Program. And this was money that was given to these organizations to provide temporary housing and aid to illegal immigrants during the Biden administration. FEMA's acting director, Cameron Hamilton, said that there's concerns that this federal money was used for illegal activities, and these NGOs may have violated federal laws against smuggling or transporting illegal immigrants. And this is interesting because this is now the federal government's getting involved in a line of investigation that has been going on in Texas since at least 2021. That's I think the earliest I started seeing court cases, like lawsuits and injunctions and legal actions from Greg Abbott and Ken Paxton against a lot of these Catholic and Lutheran charities that they said were basically doing this, basically smuggling, helping illegal immigrants get across the border illegally, and then providing them with aid and housing.
Yeah, and I would say it's not just those charity groups were not just facilitating illegal immigration. Ken Paxton, our attorney general here in Texas, also went after some of these groups for reportedly enabling them to register to vote at some of these motor voter DMV, camp outside the DMV, and as an illegal goes to get a driver's license or whatever, register them to vote with that driver's license, which may not be a legal citizen. All right. Also, the House is already in recess. There's not much going on in the House today. Senate is scheduled to go into recess tomorrow. That will last for all of next week. However, this morning there is a vote on this continuing resolution. This is going to determine whether there's a partial government shutdown. And Robert, something that we talked about, but frankly was unexpected, at least from me, is a major flip flop from Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer. He has flip flopped. He now supports the continuing resolution. He does not. He says he does not want the government to shut down, and this is causing problems for a lot of Democrats. What's going on?
Well, Schumer said yesterday that he's flipped on blocking this continuing resolution because he's worried that this would give the Trump administration more freedom to decide which parts of the government remain funded, and that this would also interfere with the Democrats' messaging campaign on the effect of Trump's tariffs on the economy. I think one part of this is that because of this disorganization of the Democratic Party, I think Schumer was worried about making that look worse by not looking like he's in control of Senate Democrats. So I think there were a lot of discussions behind the scenes of Democrats in the Senate who said they were not going to block this. And I think that was mostly coming from moderate Senate Democrats.
Robert, speaking of moderate Democrats, we have talked about this battle between the left wing of the Democrat Party and the more liberal / progressive and more moderate wing of the party. I've seen a number of calls. Apparently some Democrats are irate over this. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez released several statements. In one of those, she said there's a sense of betrayal among Democrats over this flip-flop, where she says Schumer's going along with the Trump agenda, essentially. Some activists, I also note, are calling for Democrats to replace Schumer as Senate Minority Leader. I think he can be primaried in 2028. Rick Wilson, a guy we don't mention on the show very often, he's a former Republican. He founded the co-founded the Lincoln Project. He accused Schumer of being a quote-unquote GOP sleeper agent. One Axios headline from last night reads, quote, House Democrats go into quote-unquote complete meltdown as Schumer folds. And that same Axios article also quoted one Democrat who said, quote, there is definitely a primary recruitment effort happening right now, not just Schumer, but for everyone who votes no. Robert, is this a chance for the left wing of the party, the AOC wing, the Social Democrat wing the Democratic Socialist wing to primary these Democrats who are seen as more moderate? I mean, I even saw where some people said Schumer is a center-right candidate or a center-right politician.
I think this heavily depends on where these Senate and House Democrats are at. I think in New York, Chuck Schumer has a lot of power in the Democratic Party. That's going to be a huge lift for them to primary him. However, I don't think it's a 0% chance just because New York is the most vulnerable, I think, of these political factions within the moderate part of the Democratic Party to some type of disruption, because there's a lot of New York is like a major epicenter for a lot of DSA organizing. They got AOC elected, and some of their other candidates at the local level have been getting into the New York City Council. So I think in this case, some of them are vulnerable, and it's really going to depend on where their seats at, or at what state their seats are in. I think in New York, in this case, is probably much more vulnerable than Democrats in some of these purple seats.
One of the things we noted, and this is just empirical evidence from the 2024 election, is that moderate Democrats outperformed more progressive and farther left Democrats. However, Ocasio-Cortez said last night that you look at some of these districts and there were left-wingers or people farther to the left of progressives actually winning in some of these districts. And I do just wonder, we've heard some Democrats say that Harris's problem in the 24 election is that she tried to moderate instead of going hard left. And I've seen a lot of Democrats also say that's a failed strategy. it leads me to believe that going hard left is a possibility in future elections. I know it's kind of too early to tell. I mean, we're at the end of next year, we have the midterms. Do you see the Democrats taking a hard left from here? We've talked about kind of our key assumption is that Democrats may continue to try to moderate and get a little bit closer to where voters were this last election. But there's a huge push to turn the Democrat Party into a hard left party. What are your thoughts?
I think they are vulnerable to a progressive and far left part of the coalition taking over the national level party. Part of that is the New York is a major center of gravity for DSA and other far left and progressive parts of the party. And then I saw what I thought was signals from some California Democrats that they were going to try to take the lead on this moderating of the party. But I think heading into the midterms, a lot of the most viable candidates for California governor appear to be harder left than Gavin Newsom. So I think there is I wouldn't, if I were to estimate it, try to put a percentage on it. I think it's lower than 50% chance they could take over or take control of the Democratic Party at the national level, but I don't think it's 0%.
Mm-hmm. Last point on this, and we'll move on. On today's roundtable, I will have a roll up of what the major investment banks and financial analysts and traders that I follow, what they're saying on the potential of recession. However, if we do have a recession, Robert, it seems to me that may be a very good pivot point for the left wing of the Democrat Party to push the party harder left into more socialist policies. With that, let's go ahead and move on. Just that being an open-ended question. All right, let's hit these roll-ups, starting with Dollar General. They're warning about their customers are in pretty tough shape. What's going on?
Dollar General CEO Todd Vasos, he's warning that the years of escalating prices and inflation are squeezing low-income Americans. And he's saying now that some of the customers that for Dollar General, who's a major discount store in the United States, are also not able to afford basic necessities now. And something else interesting that he said is that Dollar General's actually reported a resurgence in high-income Americans shopping at Dollar General in 2024. So it looks like it's the inflation situation is really squeezing low-income Americans, and now starting to get more high-income Americans coming into their discount stores.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Again, economic issues, I think, could push Democrats harder to the left. And I think this is a very important indicator here from Dollar General, just talking about the state of their customers. All right, let's move on here. Robert, I'll just let you take it away, starting with New York Governor Kathy Hochul.
So Trump said he's going to meet with Kathy Hochul today, and they're going to discuss building a Northeast gas pipeline. And Trump has hinted that this is the Constitution pipeline, or it's going to transport natural gas from Pennsylvania to New York. And Trump has made the point that this is going to significantly lower energy prices in the Northeast. Kathy Hochul and some of the Northeastern Democrats have really opposed building this pipeline, but I think looking at the moves that Hochul has made on energy in New York and the potential for power shortages, especially during adverse weather, could push Hochul to agree to allow the construction of this pipeline. And then the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, this is Representative Susan Delbene from Washington, said that Democrats are targeting vulnerable House seats in Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Michigan ahead of the 2026 midterms. And she also said that that this list could expand. Delbene also said that, outlined what their strategy for messaging is going to be, and that they're going to really focus on the Trump administration and House Republicans, doing this, what she called federal government restructuring while neglecting their districts. And one other important point I think Delbene made is that she said there's, quote, a different political environment without a presidential election. And looking at the elections from 2016 until 2022, it seems like there's been an increase in Democrat turnout during these midterm elections, because traditionally it's always been thought that Republican base has a higher turnout during primaries and midterm elections, but it seems to be that Democrat turnout is catching up. And I think this is also a sign that they're going to ramp up a lot of these, effectively AstroTurf town hall events where they're trying to get videos of people yelling at House Republicans to go viral.
All right. Let's move on to this article here from Commerce Secretary Lutnick, saying the United States will treat you differently if you cooperate with the Trump agenda. Jared, I guess this is your item. What's going on?
Yes, sir. So this came out during an interview with Commerce Secretary Lutnick. He said countries that understand that motive, which is to say reindustrializing the United States, and are open to working with the United States will be treated differently. And he further praised the United Kingdom and Mexico for refraining from reciprocal tariffs on American goods. Now, all this is to first praise the good behavior, and then also, really to other allies, please stop with the reciprocal tariffs. Understand that we're coming at this from a practical point of view, and we just want to, reindustrialize so that we can help you guys. He did also mention that there may be ulterior motives for some of these. The interviewer brought up Canada's reciprocal tariffs, and his response was, "Do you think this is about a trade war? This is about their way of getting electoral votes." So basically, they're just trying to posture to win their general election later on this year.
Yeah. So basically, they're saying that these Canadian politicians from the Liberal Party are entering into this trade war with Trump because it's politically popular and they have a huge swing behind them. That makes sense.
Absolutely.
Does that mean that there's a chance to de-escalate from these tariffs and the trade war after Canada's elections? Aren't they coming up like next month or something?
I think so. And I've noticed there's a bit of a dichotomy between what their national level leaders are doing and what all of their provincial level leaders are doing. Their provincial leaders are working with the United States, whether it's Alberta and Saskatchewan on energy or the Arctic territories, straight up saying, we want you, the U.S., to come invest in us because we need military investment that Canada cannot provide.
Mm-hmm.
Like they are still working with it, and that has to do with how the complexity of the Canadian system there.
Okay,
and I expect a lot more of that.
Okay, yeah, they're federal elections. I'm not sure if they've been scheduled yet, but according to this, they have to be scheduled prior to October 20th. All right, so
Yes.
Coming up. All right, let's move on. So Russian President Vladimir Putin said that he supports a ceasefire. I saw earlier this week, he said he does not want a ceasefire, but apparently he does want peace. But it kind of sounds like he's asking for a lot. I don't see the Ukrainians going along with this, but what's the latest, Jared?
Absolutely. So President Putin sent Special Envoy Steve Witkoff back to Washington with a list of concerns about the ceasefire and a request to meet with President Trump, which that has been an open discussion point for quite some time. And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Putin, quote, identifies with Trump's position. Basically, he does want peace, but he doesn't want this particular proposal. And that, quote, there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic. So it sounds like as expected, there will be some negotiations. One of the big sticking points is that Ukraine wants European troops in Ukraine for security guarantees, and Russia's never going to go along with that.
Mm-hmm.
So there will be some negotiations, but it looks like we are moving toward peace. And one thing to keep in mind, Russia did come out and say that they will only agree to a ceasefire if there is a path to peace included in it.
Mm-hmm. All right, TBA, let's move on. One of the big concerns that Robert has brought up previously is the potential for, basically, I think the U.S. farm industry is teetering on recession. The tariff war may tip them into recession. I would be surprised if we don't have one. Coming up, China is about to not renew the licenses for 1,000 meat exporters. And so looks like Chinese meat imports from the United States are set to drop about 6%. What's the latest there?
Yes, and that is all on Sunday, actually. Now, Chinese media says that none of the companies, the importing and exporting companies, and none of the government agencies are refusing or are even commenting on whether or not they would renew the licenses. So it doesn't look like that they have any intent to. Mm-hmm. And this does make up about 6% of China's total meat imports that will just stop in a day. Now, the article also released a little bit of trade data, which was nice. And they said that in 2024, Brazil and Argentina both eclipsed the United States in meat imports to China, or meat exports to China. Sorry.
Mhm.
So they won't necessarily lose all of it, but 6% is still a significant portion of it. And keeping in mind that food availability is central to Chinese governance, this does make it more difficult for them.
Mhm. I would also note Mexico is a large exporter of beef to the United States, and maybe there's an opportunity there for China to strike a deal with Mexico. Also, we've been talking about this pivot, China's pivot to Brazil for ag imports, really started back during the first Trump administration, during that first trade war. All right, let's move on to this Euro think tank. They say Europe needs 20% more troops. I wonder where they're going to get them from. What's the latest?
So this is a Brussels-based think tank, and they said that Europe needs more than 300,000 troops to make up for America's fighting capacity if the U.S. shifts its attention to the Pacific, which it is.
Yeah, there's no if there.
Right. They hedge it with an if, but
Hmm.
yes, it is happening. Now, the entirety of Europe only has 1.5 million active duty personnel. That's all of continental Europe plus the UK. And that's about 20% that they would need to make up for. In addition to that, the central command system for all European defense actually comes from the United States. So they would need to find a way to have a central command as well. There have been a few proposals on how to deal with this. Poland is talking about making all of their adult males service ready. NATO is actually coming out and saying, do not do compulsory service. It's going to kill support for Ukraine and also any potential war effort, which is interesting because that seems to say that they don't think that they can get that.
Jared, we have seen a number of NATO countries in Europe adopt compulsory service, have we not?
Yes, and there are quite a few that still have it. So I think what NATO is doing here is saying, hey, if you don't have it, don't do this. You're going to kill support for Ukraine, and we need to keep that up for a while. We've also been covering the shrinking timeline on that Europe is putting out for what they think would be a war with Russia, which I think could push them to some more rash actions in order to achieve this 300,000 troop boost. Because if you're looking at 3 to 5 years and you cannot get 200 troops in a year, now what choice do you have but compulsory service?
Mm-hmm. All right, let's end with Southcom before we move on to today's warning items. Jared, I'll tell you, there's a lot of concern. I was over on Blue Sky this morning, as I often am, looking through my Leftwing feed. Got to go over there because they're not on Twitter anymore, or X. There's a lot of concern among the left that Trump is actually serious about using military force. I think the NATO Secretary General was in D.C. and he met with President Trump yesterday. And it appeared to me he just kind of laughed off this idea that Trump said, well, we have to make Greenland part of the United States. And Trump made another joke about Canada being the 51st state. I'm not sure what to make of this report. Initially, I was skeptical. Maybe it's right. Apparently, Trump has now ordered U.S. Southern Command to prepare an invasion plan for Panama, or at least a plan to retake the Panama Canal with military force. And I get the argument that Trump does this, and his first move it's a big, beautiful first move, and it's to set the stage for negotiations. I would just say there's a lot of concern that Trump is not negotiating on this, but what's the latest here?
So the existence of the plan is about all I could find, that it is being developed, which makes sense. You don't want to give away the plan if the plan exists.
So Southern Command came out and said, we are working on a plan.
These are unnamed officials from the Pentagon.
Okay. All right.
Now, Southern Command is publicly saying we are working to collaborate with the Panamanian security forces, which that was part of the Marco Rubio deal that we covered when he made his first trip out. Mm-hmm. And I think we should probably take this in both the way that you're saying, but also it is still kind of negotiating. I think that it likely does exist. There probably really is a plan to retake the Panama Canal, but the existence of the plan would be more akin to saying, hey, you have to cooperate with us because this is a matter of our national security. If you don't, we will move here. but we're already seeing the Panamanians cooperate with the cessation of the BRI MOU, the Belt and Road Initiative Memorandum of Understanding, the selling of the ports in Panama, which we will get further into later on today. And frankly, I think there's really no way for Panama to even resist an American seizure of the Panama Canal, because they don't have a military.
Right.
So I think it is real, but it will not necessarily be used. And one great example of this is the Operation Causeway example. That was an entire plan to invade Taiwan, Formosa, in World War II that never came to fruition.
That was the point I was about to make. The Pentagon has contingency plans for lots of scenarios. I mean, I would be surprised if there weren't some plan for just about any country on planet Earth.
Yeah, I think a couple of weeks ago.
That may be an exaggeration, but this is what the Pentagon does. They come up with these contingency plans under these OCO campaigns. But what were you going to say, Jared?
Yeah. In the 51st state discourse for Canada, I think a couple of weeks ago, there was one that was disclosed from the Cold War, where it was an invasion into Canada. And obviously that has never happened. And there's no reason to think that it would happen. But nevertheless, in closed door meetings, you can say, hey, we have a plan if you don't cooperate. And as the most powerful military in the world, particularly in the hemisphere, that is a very significant negotiating tool.
Mm-hmm. All right. There's a question here. We'll cover this and move on. So we have a plan for invading the UK. Listen, I'm not saying literally take me seriously, but not literally on that, on these overseas contingency operation plans. All right, let's move on to today's warning items. Thanks for that, Jared. We have a number of items to cover under the low intensity conflict section today. By the way, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, I think, on today's roundtable. I've seen a pretty significant increase in these left-wing campaigns. We'll start out in actually Olympia, Washington today. Anarchists based in the greater Seattle area are planning an International Day Against Police. That's coming up on the 15th of March. According to a blog post, the theme is, quote, social defense and offense against police. And this one-day event features a fundraiser for prisoners, some educational topics, and also de-arrest training. We've talked a lot about de-arrest training before. This is physical, either physically blocking or in some cases physically pulling a detainee away from police custody or would-be arrestee from police custody. Seattle and Portland remain hotbeds. There are only the two tier one cities in the United States, I call tier one cities. Ground zero. And even though some of this stuff is happening, the overall activity is still way lower than what we saw from 2016 through 2021. Typically, when I've seen lots of de-arrest training events happen across the country, predominantly in New York. I cannot recall, obviously can't have eyes on every single arrest. I cannot recall seeing video or seeing any reports that some of these illegal immigrants are being de-arrested, even though there has been lots of de-arrest training. But this training still is in support of direct action against federal, state, and in some cases, local police involved in immigration enforcement. Moving on, we move over to indivisible. The House is in recess. The Senate will be in recess, or scheduled to be in recess starting tomorrow. And so there is another Musk or Us campaign being organized by Indivisible, which is I think probably the country's largest Trump resistant 2.0 group. And they are encouraging more protests and activism against Republicans. One of the things that we saw during the last recess, the Musk or Us 1.0 campaign, are these outrage at town halls. And I think that those town halls, I don't want to say it's necessarily astroturfed, but it is an irate minority of activists being pushed by these indivisible groups. And it does not take, some of these town halls are quite small. So if you even have like 15 or 20 left-wing activists there, that represents a plurality or even if you have 50 or 100, in some cases, a small majority of all attendees at these town halls. And so, of course, when you have 20 or 50 people yelling, these town halls look pretty one-sided. So I think there is some truth to this. At any rate, I think there is some truth to this being a small irate minority appearing at these Republican town halls. If you'll recall, last week or maybe the week before, we mentioned that House Speaker Mike Johnson instructed Republicans to stop holding physical town halls and instead hold virtual or phone call town halls in order to avoid these protests. They're happening again from 15 to the 23rd of March. Also, I found this interesting. In a recent survey, according to an Indivisible, 2/3 of activists wanted Democrats to shut down the government in order to get quote unquote protections from Elon Musk. They basically wanted Democrat senators to vote against the bill, this continuing resolution, in support of a 30-day CR instead of a year-long CR. And they wanted to extract certain concessions from Republicans. Apparently not going to happen. And then finally, moving on, AFL-CIO, which is kind of a union of unions, a union of trade unions. It's the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, are planning their own week of action. And this is going to include boycotts and protests from the 17th to the 23rd of March. During an online meeting to launch this week of action, one federal contract employee said, quote, "I've been here for 25 years. I'm out of a job. They canceled my union contract. I don't know what I'm going to do." And organizers at AFL-CIO responded by encouraging activists to pressure congressional Democrats to do more to disrupt the Trump agenda. Also on this topic, a couple of weeks ago, we reported about the blackout boycott, this nationwide economic boycott where activists said, we're not going to shop at any major retailers for one day. And they are now taking the small victory lap. They reported that Walmart's web traffic dropped about 6.5% during this 24-hour boycott. Amazon and Target respectively showed 4.6 and 10.9% drops in traffic. I don't think we've actually seen the sales data yet, but organizers are planning a second economic boycott. This is currently scheduled for the 18th of April, and a separate week-long boycott of Walmart will run from 7 to 14 April. Maybe a good chance to shop at Walmart. Also coming up on the 20th of March, the U.S. Postal Service workers, they are organizing a national protest against possible attempts by the Trump administration to reorganize or even privatize the Postal Service. Here's my big takeaway on this. This is the most I've reported on left-wing activism and kind of low-intensity conflict in a long while. And there is a noticeable uptick in the level of outrage over these budget cuts coming from DOJ and the Trump administration. I don't necessarily believe the polls, but if they are to be believed, recent surveys do show growing frustration over the impact of these budget cuts. We've also gotten several questions about how much these federal layoffs and firings are going to cause the unemployment rate to tick up. I've noted for months, really, the inability for both the far left and the progressive left to gain traction. We've seen a lot of protests. Now, I think I can count on one or two hands the number of times the protests have reached in the thousands. Typically, they've been far smaller. But I do actually think they're crossing the chasm here, going from relatively small groups of irate activists to a broader, more politically engaged movement. Something we're going to talk about on today's roundtable is the impacts of an economic slowdown or a recession, maybe a full-blown financial crisis. What will that do to the far left? I think this is going to be a major turning point in their inability to gain traction. This is obviously going to fuel a lot of anger and resentment because they're going to be able to pin a slowdown, or recession, or financial crisis directly on the Trump administration policies. I don't think, at least right now, I don't think we're going to get back to 2020 style riots and protests and political violence. But it could be a long summer, maybe a long fall. All right, with that, let's go ahead and move into the rest of today's warning items. Robert, this is an interesting thing. We continually see these judges, these federal judges at various levels issuing injunctions against the Trump administration. What's the latest here?
Well, yesterday, 2 federal judges, one in California and one in Maryland, they ordered the Trump administration to reinstate the probationary federal employees who were laid off in mass over the last couple of weeks. But what's important about this development, I've been paying attention to discussions around this and where this is going. And one person talking a lot about this is Dan Huff. He's a former White House lawyer during the first Trump administration. And so what I see going on here is that the courts seem to be pushing the Trump administration to defy these court orders because they're issuing temporary restraining orders in most cases and not injunctions. And the important difference here is that these temporary restraining orders are usually not appealable. So they were expanding, what they cover, how much it seems to be expanding, how much authority they're asserting over the executive branch. I think with the idea to manufacture a constitutional crisis that Democrats could exploit ahead of the midterm elections. And the reason why Dan Huff is important here is because he's outlined a strategy that I think the Trump administration is using. And one of the things I think we covered a couple weeks ago, there was talk about the Trump administration trying to force some of these lawsuits, the groups in these lawsuits, to put up basically a cash bond to get these nationwide injunctions. And I think it was last week, the Trump administration actually issued an executive order directing the DOJ to do this. And according to Dan Huff, the idea behind this strategy that he's written about, I think over the last month, is that it would deter lawsuits and avoid the Trump administration effectively stepping on this constitutional crisis landmine.
I also note a number of left-wing commentators essentially saying that this flurry of injunctions is eventually going to lead the Trump administration to directly, openly violate, maybe openly flaunt their non-compliance with these court orders. I think that's not only an interesting theory, but Robert, this should be a turning point for various left-wing movements. I mean, I think they're going to be able to look at this and say, oh, look, Trump is openly violating the courts. And I guess until some of this stuff is ruled on by the Supreme Court, I mean, I don't want to say this is necessarily a casus belli for the left, but it sure seems like an accelerator of protests, maybe even of low intensity conflict. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think there's a dynamic going on here where some of the courts in these groups, there's kind of a race to see who between the Trump administration and these left-wing and progressive groups and Democrat attorneys general are going to basically, if they're going to be able to succeed in forcing Trump to defy the courts, or if the Trump administration is going to be able to hold off long enough to get a Supreme Court decision on some of these cases. And I think we talked about Democrats coordinating this nationwide legal strategy through lawyers that have been hired by the House and the Senate, Democrats in the House and the Senate. And I think that what leads me to think that this is a purposeful strategy is that they said they are coordinating, but two, some of these cases like Hampton Dillinger, when they looked like they were going to get a decision against them before they even got to the Supreme Court, they actually tried to withdraw that lawsuit. And I'm looking out to see if in some of these lawsuits where they do get injunctions, if they start to withdraw some of the weaker ones, because then it seems to be we're kind of like on a clock of, not necessarily if. I think it's when Trump is forced to just start openly defying the courts. And I think in some cases he kind of is edging up to that, because a lot of these judges have just said in subsequent hearings that the Trump administration is not complying with some of these orders, especially like on the spending freezes at the federal agencies.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed a number of people on the right also publicly issuing support for President Trump to openly defy these lower federal court judges. I guess, Robert, we're going to start seeing protests outside the Supreme Court justices' residences again. Sure seems to be one of the next steps. All right, let's move on to this new federal task force expanding to all states. This is coming from FBI Director Kash Patel. What's the latest?
Yeah, Patel said that this FBI interagency task force that's targeting transnational organized crime is going to expand to the entire United States. And that he also said that the FBI also said that they've made 214 arrests in Virginia, where the task force has already been operating for 2 weeks. And this is mostly targeting members of Trinidad Aragua, MS-13, even members of the Sinaloa cartel. And I think this is important because cartels and these transnational criminal organizations have expanded significantly into the U.S. over the last 2 decades, and I think very significantly during the Biden administration. This even includes Chinese organized crime groups, especially in the Northeast. And I think this is going to help because I've seen in some of these congressional hearings, local and state law enforcement officials saying they just basically can't combat these groups, and they've effectively undermined federal control of parts of the national forest, Indian reservations, and even taken control of a lot of legal cannabis operations in some of these states that have legalized or decriminalized cannabis. And I think that this is a step towards the Trump administration, using this funding and these emergency powers unlocked by that foreign terrorist organization designation to start going on an offensive effectively in the cartel and foreign gang presence in the United States.
Mm-hmm. I wonder what to make of this in Oklahoma. I was up there a couple of years ago, and some state troopers took me around, one state trooper, and he was talking about all the grow houses up there because I think Oklahoma was one of the states that decriminalized marijuana. And he said, you just have a lot of Chinese money pouring in, buying up these marijuana farms. And of course, they can't put all this cash in a bank. So they have millions of dollars in cash at these various sites. And they're keeping robberies and home invasions of gangs robbing these places, taking away a lot of money. And I think the state has something like you can't transport more than like $10,000 or $15,000 or something like that without some kind of permit or something that basically says this is legal money from legal marijuana purchases. And the state trooper was telling me they keep pulling people over all the time with far more money than that, and no license to transport that amount of cash. And it got so bad, these robberies got so bad that the Chinese mafia, which apparently is running these, or some Chinese mafia group, which is running some of these grow houses, invited the Aryan Brotherhood in, like armed Aryan Brotherhood enforcers, essentially, to guard these grow houses to protect them from gang robberies. So if Kash Patel was looking for somewhere to start, I'd say that's probably a good place. If that's happening in California, I imagine that's happening in other states where marijuana has been decriminalized. All right, Robert, thanks for standing by. Let's bring Jared on and get into this port deal. So previously we talked about BlackRock buying ports up on either side of the Panama Canal. And apparently some Chinese are saying this is a betrayal of the Chinese people. What's going on?
Yeah, not just some Chinese. This is coming right from Beijing. It's the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, and also the Beijing Liaison Office to Hong Kong. Both of them are publishing the same thing. So this is actually coming from the Chinese central government, which is awesome. Now, they issued an official opinion on the BlackRock CK Hutchison port deal, stating that it was, quote, a betrayal of all Chinese people, and that it, quote, threatens to destroy the world normal shipping, trade order, and security, which is a big statement. Now, the office further warned that this is likely a template for mergers and acquisitions around the world that would take China years to recover from. And at the very end of the letter, they warned other companies to think twice about what is at stake when selling to the United States, and that they should know which side they stand on. All this, China's very obviously extremely upset about the deal going through. The CK Hutchison had basically tanked in the market. Their shares are down a pretty significant percentage. I think it was like almost 7% a single day. And there are a couple takeaways from this. First, if the Trump administration is aware of this reaction, which I have every reason to believe that they are, I think this is going to encourage further buyouts, because the Chinese are coming out and saying, hey, yeah, this hurts us beyond belief. And economically, it should hurt a fair amount, but it should not be a matter of national security coming from the capital of China. Now, this reaction also demonstrates to other Belt and Road Initiative participants that the Chinese government views all these private investments overseas as a grave matter of national security. And I think this is going to do a couple things. For the handful of countries that are not BRI countries, pretty much should seal the deal, saying, I'm not going to join this now because the Chinese are trying to influence us. But it may also further dissuade countries from renewing their memoranda of understanding like we saw with Panama. And I expect this is going, I think this is going to drive foreign policy just like it will be the main driver of foreign policy going forward, particularly for Chinese containment.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seemed to me that if you're in Europe and you're preparing to fight a war with Russia, the last thing you want is Chinese control of your ports. But that's exactly what many of them have. It seems like this may be the next, I don't know what the European equivalent of BlackRock is. Maybe it's BlackRock, but it sure seems to me like forced divestment is something we're going to see over the next few years.
Absolutely. There are a few other quotes here, but we're running pretty short on time.
Yeah, let's go ahead and do this. We are running late on time, but we will be back at 10 a.m. for the roundtable. We're going to cover your questions over on the roundtable. It's something we do every week. By the way, this is the end of the morning briefing. We appreciate you watching. Join us on the roundtable coming up at 10 a.m. Central Time. We are going to be talking about the most important things and the biggest trends that we have seen this week. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for the support. We'll be back in your inbox on Monday, back on this show starting at 08, but catch us at 10 a.m. for the roundtable. Until then, be well and stay out front.